Hello and welcome to podcast.init. We're recording today on May 4th, 2015. Your hosts as usual are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. Tonight we're interviewing Ned Batchelder, the organizer of Boston Python Meetup. You can follow us on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And please give us feedback. You can leave reviews on iTunes. You can find us on Twitter at podcastdunderinit. You can email us at hosts@podcastinit.com, or you can leave a comment on our show notes. And we recently added donation buttons to our site, so if you'd like, you can donate to help us keep this show going.
So we're going to get started with our interview now. And Ned, if you'd care to introduce yourself to our listeners, that'd be great, please.
Hi, I'm Ned Batchelder. I'm a software engineer. I have been for a long time. I describe myself as crazy old. I have gray hair. And I've been involved in the Python community in a lot of different ways over the years. Right now I work at edX, which is an organization, nonprofit that puts university courses online. It was founded by Harvard and MIT. It's an all Python shop. We're all open source, so I get to have a nice intersection between my side interests and my day job.
Great. Can you tell us about how you got introduced to Python?
Sure. Well, let's see. About 15, 16, 17 years ago, I was working at Lotus on Lotus Notes. And someone told me about a system that had an interesting authentication control system, similar to what Notes did, but more complicated. And that system was Zope. And I looked at Zope and I thought it was interesting, but the thing that really stuck with me was the language that it was implemented in, which was Python. And I'd started using Python then for little side tools and hobby projects, and gradually did more and more work in it until I got a full-time job in Python almost 10 years ago now. And I've been full-time Python ever since.
Very cool. How did you get started as the organizer for Boston Python Meetup?
Well, so Boston Python has been around for a really long time. Its history is long and varied, and I don't even know the whole history. I first attended Boston Python when it was 6 people sitting around a table at a coffee shop in Back Bay on Newbury Street, if you know Boston geography. And that must have been 10 years or so ago. It grew over time. It started meeting in Cambridge, which is where most of the tech industry is in Boston, even these days. And I was just a regular member. I would attend the meetings, and it was great to see the presentations and meet people and get to know the rest of the community. Eventually, over time, it kind of shifted. At one point, it was called the Cambridge Python Meetup, except it met in Somerville. Then we renamed that group back to the Boston Python Meetup and met in Cambridge. So it's been kind of interesting watching it meander around the Boston geography all these years. As I became more and more involved with it, I saw what I liked and I didn't like about how it was organized, and I thought I could do an okay job doing it. And at one point, the previous organizer stepped down. We were on meetup.com, and they automatically send out an email when an organizer steps down, asking if someone wants to step up. And I did, and I've been the main organizer ever since. And that's been about maybe 5 or 6 years. I should know when I took over the organizing, but it's been a while.
Great. Well, we're all glad that you did. You've been doing a phenomenal job.
Well, thank you. I have to say early on in this interview that I think one of the things that really helped me run Boston Python was the efforts of one of my co-organizers, Jessica McKellar, who unfortunately does not live in Boston at the moment and so can't help right now. But she created a number of structures that we're still using today that have been really great for growing the community and for keeping the community going.
Excellent.
She said she's going to move back to Boston someday, and I'm eagerly awaiting that.
So just out of curiosity, what are some of the structures that you're referring to, if you're willing to tell us?
Sure, no problem. So when I took over Boston Python, it was one event a month. And that was a presentation event. So we would find a speaker, and they would stand at the front of the room. and everyone would sit in chairs facing the front and would listen to the speaker. And of course there was, chatting beforehand and schmoozing afterwards and maybe some beers, but fundamentally the event was a presentation, like you might find at a conference. When Jessica joined the group, it was actually Jessica and Ashish Laroya who joined the group together. They approached me and said, what we'd like to do is we'd like to do a weekend workshop to teach beginning learners Python. And at the time it seemed to me like kind of an outrageous idea, outrageous in the sense that it would take a lot to organize, it would take a lot to run, and they seemed like two young people that had kind of a cool idea, but they'd probably run out of steam. At the time, of course, I didn't know Ashish Laroya or Jessica McKellar, and they are two young people who don't ever run out of steam, and they made that workshop happen. So that became the Boston Python Workshop for Women and Their Friends, which was specifically designed to increase the number of women who were using Python and who knew Python. And that was a hugely popular workshop, and it ran, I think we eventually ran 10 of them. And I shouldn't say we, because I personally didn't have much to do with them. It was really all Jessica. But as a group, we ran maybe 10 of them, at least 8 of them. And those workshops did a really good job growing the population of the group for two reasons. One, there were a lot of people who generally just wanted to take that workshop. But two, it was such an unusual event to be running, and to be running it so many times, that the publicity from those events just attracted people to the group. An interesting thing about people coming into the group for those workshops is one of the things I was skeptical about when they wanted to run those workshops is that I told them, well, we don't have many women in the group, right? That's the whole point. The group at the time was something like 1% female. So how are you going to get women to come to the workshop? How would you find those women? How would you publicize the event and get women to attend? Well, it turns out that if you send an email to all of the men in your mostly male group, those men have significant others, they have coworkers, they have mothers, they have daughters. Like most of those men, there's someone adjacent to them who would be really interested in that workshop. And so that really helped spread the word, even without us having to do much explicit marketing or publicity outside of our normal circles. So those workshops brought a lot of people into the group. We haven't run those workshops since Jessica left, and it really was a testament to her energy and to the amount of effort it takes to run a workshop like that. But one of the things she put in place when she ran the workshop is she knew that once the students were done with a day and a half of learning over a weekend, they would need something, a next step. And what she created for their next step was what we now call our project nights. So now Boston Python consists of 2 regular events there, and we tend to hold one of each month. So we have 2 events a month, a presentation night and a project night. And a project night is even less structured than it sounds. So there is no project set up for people to work on. A project night is simply you get a bunch of round tables and you invite a lot of people and they clump together at the tables based on their interests, and you get that room reserved for about 3 hours, and people do whatever they're going to do. So you get people hacking together, you get people teaching each other, you get people just chatting, whatever it is that people want to do in a room full of other Python-minded people is what happens. And specifically for the beginning learners who came out of the workshop, we labeled at least 2 of the tables as beginning learners. And we staffed those tables with people who were interested in helping beginning learners. And so that was the next step from the workshop. And that project night has been a really great way for Boston Python to continue to thrive for a couple of reasons. One, it's really easy to run because I don't have to find a speaker. And 2, it lets people of very different levels find something that appeals to them. One of the problems with a presentation night is if it's a beginning talk, then the advanced people don't want to come. And if it's an advanced talk, then the beginning people don't want to come. At a project night, you can have 5 different tables set up, and there are beginners at one and advanced people at the other, and they're each getting exactly what they need. So it works out really well as a way to bring people together and to give people something to do at the event. So that's what, when I said that Jessica put structures in place, that's the main one that I'm thinking of, is that other half of our events these days are the project nights that she created specifically as a place for beginning learners to go as a next step in their learning.
That's very cool, and I definitely think that there's a lot of hard wrought experience has shown a lot of different people that putting beginners and more advanced practitioners in the same room and kind of like saying, okay, you're all in the same pool, you're all working towards the same goal, it benefits everyone. I think that the more advanced people, whether they end up realizing it or not, learn by teaching other people, and the beginners learn obviously by virtue of being taught, but everybody ends up benefiting. I think that's great. I'm glad to hear that that's been such a motive force in helping to keep Boston Python going.
Yeah, and it's really true that one of the things I think is really interesting about the dynamic of the project night is that a lot of people come to the project night with an idea of what it's going to be like for them, and then they have a completely different kind of night that they also have valued. So people will show up with their laptop, and they'll sit down next to someone, and they've got a project they're going to work on, but they spend the whole evening just talking. Or someone comes in because they want to learn something themselves, but instead they sit at the beginner's table and they spend the night teaching. And that to me is really interesting to see, that people can have their horizons broadened. That might be too grandiose a term, but people can experience the community in different ways than they thought they really wanted to, and find different aspects valuable at the end of the night, and really enjoy what they've done. A lot of people come to project night thinking about projects, but end up talking, and if you had said, why don't you come and just chat with people for 3 hours, they never would have shown up. But once they've spent the evening talking to people and deepening those connections, they've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, speaking as somebody who's attended the project nights a number of times, every night I go there and think, oh, I'm going to end up working on this project or other, and I never do.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, right. I just end up meeting somebody, or maybe helping somebody else with a problem, or just playing with some cool toy that somebody happened to bring to the meetup.
Right. Yeah, and I never work on a project at project night because I'm kind of the host and I'm milling around talking to everyone. So I really enjoy being able to meet people and connect people, and tell someone on one side of the room that there's a person on the other side that's doing exactly what they need to find out, and et cetera, et cetera.
So how much of your time ends up being dedicated to the Python community and the meetup itself?
Well, so that's a good question. And I hesitate to actually count it because I might decide it's too much. So there's a couple of different ways that I'm involved in the Python world. And so as I mentioned, my day job is actually a Python job. I organize the Boston Python group. I'm the maintainer of coverage.py, which is my technical side project. So there's time that goes into that, which is really, pro bono work for the community. And then there's various other, monitoring various communication channels. I like to dip into Stack Overflow a little bit, and the Python IRC channel on Freenode is very appealing to me right now. I used to closely follow the Python mailing list, although I've pulled away from that. I find it very interesting to see how people are interacting around this technical topic that I'm very interested in. And it seems like kind of an odd reason to be interested in people, because they are also interested in a programming language. But, there's no bad reason to be interested in a bunch of people, I guess. And so it might as well be, start with your interest in a computer and let that grow into an interest in people. So if I had to gauge how much time I spend outside of work on the Python community, it would probably be on the order of 20 hours a week, which is a lot.
Yeah, but I understand it. That is definitely a lot. But if you think about the average person and like how many hours per week they spend, I don't know, watching TV, or even if you think about like the average person, how much time they spend commuting or something like that.
Yes.
I'm guessing that you're actually getting. It's not like, so on the one hand, you're putting this time in and it's selfless, right? Like you're not getting paid for this per se.
Right.
But I mean, I can even tell you just from doing this podcast that we've done, I feel like it has already paid dividends that are way harder to quantify than it might appear at first. So I can only imagine there's something like that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned TV. So often when I'm watching TV, I'm also in the Python IRC channel, which is why, although I've watched all of Game of Thrones so far, I'm really bad at understanding the intricacies of the plot. Which is so if I watch with my family, they can help pull me along. No, absolutely. So I'm interested in these discussions. Hearing people talk about Python, whether it's the community or the language or the implementation of the language or the libraries around the language, or how do you solve a problem, or how would you compare it to a different language? There's all sorts of aspects that I personally find technically interesting. Being involved in the community gives me a depth of understanding that comes in a couple of different forms. So even though, for instance, I have been using Python for a long time and I know all about how it works. But even so, if I sit down with a beginner, whether it's in the IRC channel or in person at Boston Python Project Night or at PyCon after one of my talks, and I hear a question that they ask, that question often will be new to me because they are coming at it from a completely new perspective. And, to be blunt, often it's the wrong perspective, right? They've had some misunderstanding, but seeing how they have misunderstood something that to me seems so clear is a really good way for me to understand how they're thinking, to see what problems there still are in what we all take for granted as experts, and maybe gives me an idea about how to explain things differently the next time that will help other people understand things better. Programming languages are really, really esoteric, right? Python prides itself on being easy to read and approachable and all that, but easy to read for a programming language is really, really hard to read, right? We say print all the time without ever stopping to think about the fact that there is no paper and no ink involved. So what do you mean by print?
Yep.
And we just take it for granted, and we've just sort of internalized 50 years of computer history that if we think about it, we can get back to why would we call that print. But to a beginner, that is complete nonsense. And
right.
So hearing beginners talk about things is a really interesting way to learn more about the language. Just like hearing experts talk about things is a really interesting way to learn more about the language. So I get that kind of technical depth from being in the community and seeing what people are talking about. There's also the new expert depth. So Python is continuing to grow and expand, and in all sorts of ways that I don't understand, right? So there's Tulip, which has become the new async thing. Guido is talking about gradual type hinting, which I still don't quite understand how that would work in a real-world scenario. There are alternate implementations of Python. There's the expansion of Python into data sciences, which I don't do either for a living or for a hobby, so it's all kind of foreign and exotic to me and looks like a fascinating solution to a problem I wish I had so I could use the solution. There's all sorts of new ways to explore even within this, one thing we call Python. And then being involved in the community also gets you involved with the people in the community. I know lots of people around the world purely because of my involvement in the Python community, either in mailing lists or in person at PyCon or from having contributed to projects or from running Boston Python. And those people give my experience of the Python world a whole another layer of depth. Because, so for instance, I have this habit when I hear about a new library and I go to PyPI to look at the page about it, I immediately scroll down and see who wrote it. And oftentimes it's someone that I don't know, but sometimes it is someone that I know either by reputation or in person. And that just gives me another aspect, another way to understand that library, right? That person's reputation is attached to it. And by being involved in the community in a bunch of ways, I have contact with many more people, and that gives me a deeper sense of what's going on in the community.
Absolutely. So dovetailing with the community aspect of the previous question, what are your goals for the Boston Python community?
My goals? Well, I would like it to continue to grow, both in the number of members that show up at events and also in the kinds of events. So, I'm really glad that we are running the presentation nights and the project nights that we are. But to be frank, we've been doing that 2-event structure for a while now, and maybe there's better things we could be doing, other things we could be doing. Maybe we don't have to get rid of those 2 things, but isn't it time that we added something else? So, for instance, one of the mailing lists I'm on is the group organizers mailing list, which has people from around the country talking about what they do in their user groups. Chicago is very active right now, and they have a very interesting one-on-one mentoring program. It runs, I think the detail is that they run it for a 3-month stretch where they get potential mentors and mentees. I guess if that's the word, it sounds like a big seal, but I guess that's what it is. Mentees. So they get potential mentors and mentees, and they get paired up for a 3-month stint of working together in some way. And I think Chicago has only just started this. I think they've done 1 round of 3 months and maybe are preparing to do their 2nd round. But that's a really interesting structure. And it would be great if Boston could try something like that. One of the things I've wanted to do for a while is to create smaller events, like a 5-person event that's organized not by me, but by a member that wants to get what I've been calling a study group together. And this idea started because I would get an email from someone who lives in the Boston area but far from Boston, let's say Lowell, which is about 45 minutes or an hour north of Boston, depending on the traffic. And they say to me, I really want to come to Boston Python events, but I work in New Hampshire and I live in Lowell, and it's just too much to come into Cambridge and go back. Is there anything happening in Lowell? And Boston Python isn't going to run a full-fledged event in Lowell because I don't think there are that many people in Lowell who would come to it. But there are probably 5 people in Lowell or near enough that if that person said, hey, I can't make it into the events, but I'm going to be at the Starbucks on Tuesday evening at 8, and I'd love to have 5 people show up just to chat about what you're working on. You could probably get 5 people to do that. So I've been trying for a while to build a website, and when I say I've been trying to build a website, what I mean is I've been trying to cajole people into building a website for me that would let people organize those study groups. And I think that would be really interesting to see what we could get done, what could happen with 2 to 5 people meeting in an ad hoc way for whatever reason they want.
Actually, Ned, I feel like I should chime in here because I don't know if you follow Saron Barak. I'm completely mangling her name, which is a real shame. It just proves how insular I am. But as an average American, mm-hmm. But she's doing this amazing thing called Code Newbies. I don't know if you've heard of it or seen it.
I haven't.
Okay, I will. I actually picked it last episode, and I will toss you a link. And what's kind of amazing, she runs a podcast. She does a weekly Twitter chat. They have a discourse forum, and it is this whole kind of, to say it is a community, I guess it is one community, but it's one community with a multiplicity of different mediums, I guess, for all oriented towards helping people who are learning how to program, who are trying to even go beyond that and get a career going in the tech industry, doing everything that it takes to help them achieve that goal. And one of the interesting things is she runs, in addition to having the podcast and the Twitter chat, she runs a discourse forum. Mm-hmm. And in that forum, there's a whole section for study groups. You get a bunch of people who are going to get together and say, let's go read and work through, a structured interpretation of computer programs, or let's go work through beginning Python, or like learn Python, or whatever it is.
Yep.
And they've had great success with that. And it sounds like this is the kind of thing that you're hoping to do, but on an in-person kind of local level, right, which would be great.
Yeah, exactly. Although it doesn't have to be beginners, right? One idea is, I'm a computational biologist and I work at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, and there's probably a bunch of people right here who want to talk about Python. So let's get together and talk about Python and genomes or whatever. There's all sorts of reasons why people might be so finely sliced that 5 people is the right number to get together for geography or time or interest or skill level or whatever.
Absolutely. It's funny that you would drop that particular institution as an example. I worked for the Broad for 5 years, and and there were a bunch of people there who were really excited about Python. I'm guessing it's no accident that you mentioned this.
Well, I mention it because, first of all, I'm really proud that I know how to pronounce the Broad Institute. For listeners, it's spelled Broad, so if you're not in the know, you'll say the Broad Institute. But also because that's a really specialized domain, and I know that when we do have a presentation night about science, we get a completely different slice of the group that shows up for that, and they're really into it. But for the most part, our presentation nights are not scientific enough for them. And so maybe they want to have something off to the side. One of the things about the Python community in Boston is that not only do we have Boston Python as a user group, which is really large, over 5,000 members, but we also have Django Boston, which is a separate group on Meetup, and PyLadies Boston, which is a third group on Meetup. And so we've got 3 user groups that are running all about Python topics in Boston. So it's a really vibrant community.
That's awesome. I mean, I also think that speaks to the fact that we were just talking about this last episode. I feel like Python has really sort of, I mean, as you say, it's very old. It's been around forever, but I feel like recently it's experienced this kind of blossoming in terms of it's expanded into so many other different kinds of communities, where it always had a foothold, but I feel like in such a big way that kind of it never had before. And it sounds like this is just an example of that.
Yeah, and the data sciences is really the latest blossoming for Python, right? So Python sort of started in science, and then the web came along, and it became big in web. But now with data science and IPython notebooks and Pandas and Anaconda and the other scientific distributions, it's really catching on among data scientists as a more disciplined programming language than R for doing the kind of work that they want to do. So something that's a little more capable in a broad sense, and they find Python, and they seem to gravitate towards that.
So speaking of keeping things healthy, what do you find to be the most important things for building and maintaining a healthy community?
Well, so it's interesting because it varies depending on which aspect of community you're talking about. For something like a user group, I think the key to a success for a user group, and this sounds really, really simple, is to be predictable. If you can pick a schedule of events and pretty much stick to it so that people know what to expect, then people will start coming regularly, and they will be able to explain to their friends that they can come here and find things. Like I said, we're on a 2-event-a-month schedule. If an organizer in another location doesn't feel like they can maintain that schedule, either because they can't find the space, or they can't find the sponsors for the pizza, or they don't have enough speakers, just say you're going to do 1 event every 2 months, or 1 event even every 3 months, which is a long time between events, but I think it's better than saying I'm going to do an event every month, and after 3 months it kind of peters out because you ran out of the money or the space or the speakers or whatever. It's better to pick a cadence that is going to work and work with that cadence, and then once you've grown enough that you can increase that cadence, you can increase it. I really found that having that kind of predictability really attend. And like I said, with the project nights, it doesn't have to be an ordeal to find a speaker. You can run an event without a speaker and just have people work together. It might be a little bit difficult when you've only got 5 people, until you've gotten 50 people. But those 5 people are interested enough to come out together. They will probably find something to talk about and be glad for that 6th person to show up the next time, and you'll grow from there. And on the subject of speakers, a big point of mine is that when there are people sitting and listening to a talk, they're probably thinking of themselves as different than the speaker, that the speaker has some form of expertise or authority that gives them the right or the permission to be up in front of everyone talking for 20 or 30 minutes. And then the people in the audience feel like they don't have that permission or authority or expertise. And I'm a huge believer in the idea that everyone has at least one talk in them. And it may not be the kind of talk you're expecting. Some people will say to me, I want to talk about this library, but I didn't write the library. Is it okay if I talk about it? And the answer is, of course. If you've got something to say, if you want to show something to someone, you can stand up and talk about that, even if it's for 10 minutes. So finding speakers can sometimes seem daunting, but if you're coming at it looking at PyCon and looking at the speakers that are there and thinking that you have to somehow get a speaker like that for your user group, it's going to be very difficult. Instead, what you want to do is you want to reach out to the people who are already members of your group and find out what is it that they want to say. And it might be something very simple, what was that bug that you fixed at work the other day? Or, you know how at work you're the person that everyone comes to for blank? Well, whatever blank is, you can talk about blank. And people will listen to you, and they would be glad for you to have told them what you know. So, I call it my parlor trick, that anyone who thinks they don't have a talk in them, come and talk to me, and I will figure out what your talk is about. Because it'll only take about 5 minutes of chatting with you to figure out what you can explain. I had one woman once tell me that she had nothing to talk about because she was just beginning to learn Python. And I said, you can talk about what it's like to learn Python, right? How did you make that leap from print hello world to for I in range of 10 print hello world? There's a leap there, and you made it, and other people will be interested to hear it. And you can do a talk about that. So that's healthy user groups. Other kinds of communities, online communities, are more difficult because online communities don't involve face-to-face communication, and therefore it's much easier to get into bad behavior. I think I can think of one instance in a face-to-face user group event at Boston Python where someone did something that seemed like a code of conduct violation. And I hope that that's true, and it's not just me being oblivious to something bad that's happened at Boston Python, although that's of course entirely possible. But once you get into IRC channels and mailing lists, things run off the rails really, really easily. And there you have to be much more willing to tell people off and enforce the rules, and the rules will also, if you have the tool available to you, the rules will involve banning people, because allowing one bad apple into the barrel is much worse than excluding a bad apple so that the rest of the community can help. So that's the two sides of community, keeping a healthy community. I've personally found face-to-face communities, especially local communities, work pretty well without a heavy hand. The online communities, you have to be willing to be the bad guy and kick people out in order for them to stay healthy.
Right. It's interesting talking about, going back just a couple of points there, to everyone having one talk in them, and if you learn something, tell other people how you learned it because they might find it interesting. I was just thinking, one of the things that I listened to another podcast from the Thoughtbot folks on the Ruby side, and one of the things that Ben, I can't think of his last name now, but in any case, the podcast host, or one of the hosts, has said repeatedly is blog what you learn to new people coming into the field, and that strikes me to be very similar, right? Like if you giving a talk or writing a blog post, it's kind of the same sort of thing in the sense that by explaining to people what you learned and how you learned it, you've solidified the knowledge for yourself, and it's also a way to show, prospective employers what you know, that you can actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And I think all of that kind of sums up to the same sort of thing and has a great deal of value.
Right. And I found in my own writing and speaking that I learn a lot by doing the writing and doing the speaking. So I've done a lot of PyCon talks over the years, and the one that's probably the most popular still is the one I did, I think, 3 years ago about Unicode. And the things I said in that talk, half of them I didn't know until after I decided I was going to do a talk about Unicode. So once you commit to an idea that you're going to explain something to someone, that really means that you're going to have to know it well, right? You're going to have to explore all of your knowledge about that topic, and you're going to find parts where your knowledge falls short, and you're going to extend that knowledge so that you can give it to someone else. When I write a blog post, often I only half know what I'm talking about, and one of the things I really look forward to is people putting comments on my blog or replying to my tweets saying, actually, if you'd done it like this, it would have been better. And that's how I can learn, right? Someone once said the best way to get information off of the internet is not to ask a question, but to state the wrong thing. Because lots of people won't answer your question, but everyone will correct you if you're wrong. So my blog posts often are me sort of getting halfway to a solution, and then everyone chiming in and helping me figure out what the full solution would have been. And that's one of the great things about writing a blog or having a Twitter stream, which is that people will talk back to you, and you will have a conversation, and you will learn things. So I definitely encourage people who think they don't have something to talk about at a user group to pick something that interests them, no matter how boring you think it is, and you will give a good talk about it.
How do you keep people engaged outside of the monthly meetings?
I'm not sure I've done enough to keep people engaged outside of the monthly meetings. We have a Twitter account, we have an IRC channel, and we have both the meetup.com mailing list and a separate mailing list that we set up at python.org. And we set up the python.org one because we had to turn on strict moderation for the meetup.com mailing list because of recruiters sending out, the usual recruiter stuff. And once you turn on that moderation, it becomes very difficult to have an organic conversation where members are talking amongst themselves about actual topics, because every email has to be approved for going out, which means that someone asks a question, and if I'm not looking at the moderation queue, there'll be 5 answers all stuck in the queue, and then they'll all go out at once, and the conversation's very stilted. So I created a separate mailing list at python.org. It's boston@python.org. And we've got about 220 people subscribed to that mailing list, which is not bad for a mailing list, although out of 5,000 members of the user group, it's a tiny fraction of the entire membership. So I continue to send out email messages reminding people about that mailing list. And it gets very little traffic, maybe one message a week. So I'm not sure there is much that people are doing as a group outside of those events. We have 2 events a month, so people can, show up pretty regularly, and we do have some people who are quite regular in attending the events. I would like to do more. That's like I said about growing the group. I would like to see other kinds of events. For instance, one thing we've never tried is just a purely social event. Hey, you're a member of Boston Python? I am too. Let's go see a movie. It doesn't have to be about Python. Who knows? That's not the kind of event that comes naturally to me. But maybe someone else wants to say, I'll run that for Boston Python, and I would be glad to have someone step up and propose a completely different kind of event that we could run alongside the 2 we already have.
Absolutely. A Boston Python board gaming night or something like that.
I'm sure that'd be huge. I'm surprised we haven't had a board game table at the project nights. One of the tables we often have is a puzzle table. One of our members, John Bohannon, is a huge puzzle fanatic, and he likes both collecting physical puzzles and writing new puzzles. So he's written a number of puzzles for the project night, and we've collected them at puzzles.bostonpython.com. And when he comes, we'll turn his table into a puzzle table, and people just sit around and solve puzzles.
Yeah, very speaking cool. As somebody who has tried some of his puzzles, they're all very fun, and some of them are quite brain-twisting.
Yes. Well, John's very good at writing a puzzle that starts out really simple, and then has sort of 4 or 5 levels of difficulty, where the 5th level is, this is actually impossible, and if you could do it, we'll give you a PhD right here on the spot.
So, what do you like the most and the least about the Python community, both locally and at large?
Well, so at large, the Python community as a whole, worldwide, is known for being very progressive. And I don't mean that politically, although it probably holds, but what I mean is that I think they tend to be at the forefront of the social issues that surround technical communities. So it's probably no surprise to any of the listeners of the podcast that technical communities tend to be not nearly as diverse as the general population. The people who are in the minorities in the technical community, whether by gender or by race, find them very difficult to break into, find them difficult to stay in, they find them difficult to bring new people in. The Python community, I think, has been a leader in helping to change that. So, for instance, the last 2 years at PyCon, we have had 30% female speakers at a technical conference, which is astounding. It would be even more amazing if we could get to 50% to match the general population, but a technical conference with 30% female speakers is really unusual. So I'm really proud of the Python community for being that intent on addressing those issues, talking about them and doing things to fix them. So that's the thing I'm most proud of. I personally am very engaged in trying to make Python as a community as welcoming as possible. One of the things that interested me about the IRC channel originally was the bad reputation it had, and to study that from the inside and to see what could be done to improve it. And I think it is improving. IRC is a harsh medium to begin with, but people can still be nice on it. So, and I would like to think that we're improving that way. So those are the things I like about the worldwide community. There's a downside to being at that much of the forefront of the social issues, which is that we can get caught up in debates and struggles over those very issues. Even today, there is a turmoil on the Python Software Foundation mailing list about the current election for the board of directors and some missteps that were taken and what to do, how to fix it, and whether we're doing the right things to fix it or we're making it worse to fix it. And I haven't gotten involved in that whole debate, but I see it happening, and I see people getting very angry at each other because they feel very strongly about all of the issues. So other communities maybe would have dealt with this by just having some leader say, everyone shut up, we're going to do it this way, and I don't care what you think. And that would be good. The Python community deals with it by everyone having a very strong opinion and wrangling very hard over the philosophical issues and how best to be fair and inclusive and do the right thing. And that, unfortunately, can also lead to bad behavior and strong opinions and hurt feelings. And, that's a downside. I don't know that there's a way to have a community that could push forward through these issues without that downside, but it is a downside.
As long as in the end analysis, when the debates are over, everyone sort of says, well, we were all we were all trying to do the right thing, and puts their differences aside and moves on and doesn't harbor resentments over it. That's the important thing, I would think.
That is the important thing, and we'll have to see how it comes out. There are some pretty hurt feelings right now, and from the past, I can tell you it does not always work out that everyone comes back into the community having felt like, well, at least we were all trying to do the right thing. Sometimes people leave, and that might happen this time.
And sometimes, and occasionally, as bad as it is, when a community loses a person who has been a real driving force and who has done a lot for the community, sometimes that's okay too. I mean, obviously it's sad when it happens and when there's hurt feelings and strife, but sometimes, I can't help but think of, and I know some people really hate Steve Jobs, but I'm going to mention Steve Jobs here anyway. In his presentation, his speech before, I want to say it was Stanford graduating class, where he talks about, in this case, something way more weighty than leaving a software group, but he talks about death being one of the great change agents. And I think sometimes, in these organizations, sometimes in order for them to evolve, sometimes people need to leave, right? Like sometimes people need to move on and make space for a new viewpoint, a new opinion, someone who doesn't have that baggage and can just sort of say, well, okay, what do we need to do? Let's move forward.
Yeah, I don't know how this particular turmoil is going to work out, sort of what the long-term effects are going to be. It's painful to watch, but yeah, it has to happen sometimes. There's no way around it. I mean, if you're going to have a large group of people, all of whom feel passionate about something, and who are willing to put in energy to something, there's bound to be conflict, and there's bound to be people who suffer because of that. Like I said, locally we haven't had that kind of conflict. I'm hoping we don't, but that might happen to us too as a local group. And if it does, we'll just have to try to be open and honest with each other and listen to each other and, try to do the best we can.
Anything's possible, but I think size can help, right? Like, I mean, there's a difference in scope between the Python Software Foundation, which is this organization which touches so many thousands of people, and Boston Python. Not to say that it couldn't happen, but just I think in this case that the size actually is to our benefit.
Yes, right. I mean, we are a large user group. We're over 5,000 people, but it's still much smaller than the Python community worldwide.
Right. So on slightly happier topics, perhaps not entirely, but how do you strike a balance between sponsors and the rest of the community? Do you have policies around sponsored presentations or talks?
Oh, absolutely. So we tend not to do sponsored talks, and let's back up. So first, it was very interesting to see what happened in Boston Python. So one of the things that has been a great benefit to Boston Python is the Microsoft New England Research and Development Center, which has the acronym NERD because they're really clever. They provide free space to us, and that's been a great help for us growing, because it meant that we never had to worry about where are we going to find space this month, and that space can hold up to 300 people, so we can hold really large events. When Microsoft first had that space available, remarkably, they also always bought us the pizza. So we had free food and free space every month, and that was amazing. At some point, Microsoft decided they couldn't afford the pizza somehow, and I was really scared at that point because I didn't know how we were going to pay for the pizza, right? We didn't have any infrastructure in place. And at first, we were just collecting money at the door. We just passed around an envelope and hoped that people donated enough money. Eventually, though, we grew a separate mailing list of people who were trying to hire Python developers. And people who are trying to hire Python developers have a hard time of it because hiring developers is always hard these days. And they're willing to spend money to get in front of developers. So we now have people paying for pizza in order for the right to stand up and talk about their job. And one of the things I like about that transition from Microsoft buying pizza to sponsors buying pizza is when Microsoft bought the pizza, we were a community of users. Now we're a community of users and a community of companies. And we really do have a number of companies in the Boston area who really feel like members of the group. Either they've done something unusual for the group, or they consistently show up, or their employees consistently show up, or for whatever reason, it feels like a company as a member of the community. I'm really grateful for that because, we're all hoping to get jobs and we need to work, and so companies are an essential part of the Python ecosystem in Boston or any town. But that said, we do only provide a minute speaking slot for companies that are sponsoring. If someone comes to us and says, I would really like to do a talk, I look very carefully at what the talk is. And it's really easy for a company to say, I want to do a talk about what we've built, and for it to be not, here's how we built a thing, but here's the thing we built. And if they want to talk about here's the thing we built, then that sounds like a sales pitch. And I don't want sales pitches for talks, right? The members don't want to feel like they're being sold to. I want the talks to be peer-to-peer. So I want an engineer at the front of the room talking about the challenges they faced while building a product. That's fine. But if a non-engineer gets up at the front of the room and starts explaining all the features of the product, that's right out. And I try to weed those out ahead of time. And I've only had one lightning talk, a 5 or 10 minute talk, where I said to the person up front, it's got to be a technical talk. And the person got up to do their talk, and the technical part was the bullet where they said we used a lot of Python libraries. And all the rest of it was, it wasn't great. But at least it was only a lightning talk.
Right.
So one slipped by me. But yeah, we definitely we try to keep a very strict line between sponsors who have things to sell us, which is fine. If someone wants to say, hey, I will sponsor the pizza for a night because I want to stand up and say, hey, everyone, buy my product. That's fine. That hardly ever happens. If it does, it tends to be a developer product anyway. Use our API to build something cool. hey, they paid the money. They can say whatever they want for that minute or two. But no, you're not going to get a 20-minute chance to pitch to members. I don't care how much money you've spent. That's not what the group is for.
All right, I think that's fantastic, and that's really important. There was a meetup that both Tobias and I went to recently, and I love the meetup. I plan to continue going no matter what, but they had a couple of talks in there that really boiled down to sales pitches, and I can only say that when companies come to technical meetups and give what amounts to really a sales pitch with very little technical content, I think they're unselling units, if you know what I mean. Like I know in my case, I say to myself, I really doubt that I would buy this thing because I just walk away with a very negative impression of that vendor. And I think that's great that you have that policy. I think that's really smart. Thank you.
Yeah, they've got kind of a tin ear if they're coming there and pitching like that. You're exactly right. The main message they're going to give to those people in that audience is, "Hi, I don't know what I'm doing."
Yep, and I don't care about my audience.
And I don't care about you. Right, exactly.
Great. So, if I or any of our listeners decided that we wanted to start our own local community, how would you go about getting started with that?
So, there's a mailing list at python.org, group organizers, which has lots of people on it from around the country and around the world who run local user groups. They are a good source of advice and encouragement. The way to get started is first figure out how you can get the word out in your community, right? There's going to be some way that you can let people know that something's happening. And meetup.com, which has some downsides, is really good at that. If you start a group on Meetup, they will send an email to other people in your geography who have or members of groups that have similar tags to the tags you've put on, saying that there's a new meetup group. So you'll get some members just from there. But you'd also like to figure out, are there universities nearby that have computing clubs? Is there a mailing list of, just 20-somethings in the area? I mean, I have no idea what would be the right way to start. I've never started a group. I took over a group that was already in full swing. But you need to get the word out, right? You need to let people know. And tweeting things can be a good way. And if you get onto a tweet stream that has enough followers, some fraction of those followers will be in your area and they will hear about it and come. You want to have food. So what I've definitely found is the difference in attendance between an event with food and an event without food is huge. Sometimes after our presentation nights, we head over to a bar. And some nights that is sponsored, meaning that the beer is free. And on the nights when it is not sponsored, no one goes to the bar. So people will definitely show up if you give them free food or free beer. And if you have to find a sponsor for that, who's an employer in your area, even if you have to collect payment from people at the door, at least if you have food there, then they can fit it into their email. And other than that, be predictable, think with an open mind about what might interest the people that you're trying to attract. It doesn't have to look like a tiny PyCon. It can be other kinds of activities. And do it on a schedule that you can sustain. So be predictable and know that it's going to start small and it's going to grow. Right? Boston Python has 5,000 members now, but it didn't always. The first time I went, there was 6 people sitting around a table at a coffee shop. It'll grow from there.
That's great. So, getting more general for a moment, what's the state of Python from your perspective?
Well, Python, so I mentioned before about the data science aspect. Python seems to show no signs of slowing down. There was a while back there where it seemed like it was sort of Python and Ruby in the web space, and now I get the sense kind of that a lot of the Ruby people are now off onto Node.js, while the Python people are still using Python. And meanwhile, the bioinformatics people are picking up on Python, and the data science people are moving from R to Python. And, Python seems to continue to find areas where it can thrive. And it seems to be living up to its reputation as a general purpose tool that people can pick up and do pragmatic things with. And that's why it seems to find new footholds in new domains like it's been doing. It's, I guess, 24 years old now, Python is, which is pretty old for a programming language. And there are plenty of programming languages that are younger than that have peaked, and Python doesn't seem to be doing that. The whole Python 2 versus Python 3 conflict was kind of unfortunate. It would have been good to somehow manage that transition better. I'm not going to predict when tipping point is for Python 3. I know that it's a very usable ecosystem now. The language, Python 3 as a language, had always been fine. The problem was the library support, and that seems to be not an issue anymore unless you're still using Twisted or one of the few large libraries that hasn't been ported yet. But these days, if you're starting a new project, there doesn't seem to be a reason not to use Python 3. There are good options for whatever you might need there. The next big drama for the language, I guess, is going to be this type hinting proposal, which has people on both sides of it. Some days I think that Guido started the type hinting controversy so that people would stop talking about the Python 2 versus Python 3 controversy. But so the type hinting thing, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. It's kind of completely contrary to one of the central tenets of the language, or at least it appears to be at first blush. And so that's sort of line both sides of the debate.
Great.
Yeah.
So
the community seems great and growing not only in size but in complexity and richness, which I think is a really great sign. You know, the fact that the diversity at PyCon is continuing to grow, I think heralds really well for the future of the language as a whole.
So, I just wanted to say one thing briefly about the way you see it. Ruby people are moving on to Node. You're not wrong, and I have to say this because I'm relatively new to Python. I've been a Ruby guy for years and years and years, since the late 90s, early 90s, and I've only gotten into Python over the last 5 or 6 months. And I have to say, I really love the language of the community. I'm really, really loving it, which is part of the reason I chose to do this podcast with Tobias. But I think, and I totally agree with you in a larger sense, and I definitely think that Ruby has found its niche. For Ruby, there's Rails, and there's infrastructure as code, tools like Chef, and the HashiCorp tools like Vagrant and the like. And that's kind of it, right? It's still thriving in those two niches, but it's not growing into new areas like Python is. And I just want to say one thing about people, the Ruby people moving on to other environments like Node and such. I think there's an important distinction there, right, between sort of, yes, the luminaries in the Ruby scene are very publicly sort of they're no longer blogging about Ruby. They're blogging about Go or Rust or Node or whatever other thing has struck their fancy that they're now learning about. First of all, a lot of these people, their day jobs are still writing Ruby on Rails code.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I feel like it's sort of, I'm going to reuse a phrase from Scott Hanselman. He talks about, and I think he might have even taken it from somewhere, the cold dark matter programmers, right? There's those of us who kind of live in this very forward thinking kind of bubble of, we read blogs, we listen to and or make podcasts, we run user groups, we are heart and soul, bleeding edge technologists, but there is this huge corpus of people who aren't bleeding edge and who are going to be using the technology that from many people's perspectives is kind of tired for many years to come. And I think there's a tremendous installed base now of Ruby on Rails code out there, and that's not going anywhere. So I totally agree. I think that Python is burgeoning and blossoming into all kinds of new amazing areas, but I don't want to make it seem like Ruby is dying on the vine. It's not. It's just that it seems like, from my perspective, it's found its niche or niches, and it's thriving there.
Yeah. And, this is a bad habit, that people get into where they set up competitions and choose a side and then talk trash about the other side without necessarily actually having any real information. And one of the downsides of being as heavily embedded in the Python community as I am is I really don't know that much about any other programming communities. So I shouldn't say things like that about Rails. It's great that Python is thriving in the areas that it's thriving in. I should leave it at that.
No, I mean, I know that there was no malice in what you said, but I totally agree with you. I think, and I would actually encourage you. I know you're already putting in 20 hours a week, so it's not like you can say, hey, I'm going to go spend yet more time learning another thing. But I would definitely encourage you and everyone who listens to this, if you are heavily embedded in one language camp, go play with another language, right? Like, I mean, you don't have to necessarily like invest your heart and soul into it or spend huge amounts of time, but just sort of like dip a toe in. And I mean, this is something I've been telling Ruby people lately. Just take a look at some of the Python stuff out there. You don't even have to like the language. I kind of don't even care that the typical, each side has little like ranting points that they use when they're ranting about the other. For Ruby people, it's like syntactic white space, and for Python people, it's often like the glyphs and monkey patching. And it's just kind of like, okay, I understand, but put down the torch, and put down the pitchfork, and go take a look at some of the amazing things these folks have built. And I feel like that should apply equally on both sides, because the Ruby folks have some really great toys, and the Ruby language has some aspects of it that are incredibly elegant and worth at least understanding. You may walk away and say, I really don't like this. I'm never going to choose it as my go-to programming language, or whether it's Ruby or Go or Rust or something else. I feel like we all need to kind of break out of our comfort zones and do everything that we can to kind of put aside that partisanship. I feel like in the era of the polyglot programmer, it is to our mutual benefit to sort of start regarding these tools as exactly that, just tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right, so last question. Just wondering if you feel or think that Boston will ever have its own regional Python conference, because I've definitely been seeing a number of local and regional conferences popping up all over the place, and so far Boston is noticeably lacking in that department.
That's right. So there's Pi Ohio and Pi Tennessee and Pi Texas and Pi Gotham in nearby New York City. And Boston's never done that. And we've toyed with the idea. We actually toyed with the idea of making a bid to bring PyCon to Boston. But we never pulled the trigger on it. And so that would require someone stepping up to do it. I'm not that interested personally in making it happen, just because it's a lot of work to make the usual user group happen, and the usual user group, I think, is a really good way for the local communities to stay connected. I'm not sure how much an annual regional conference that would bring people from all over the country potentially, how that feels as a local event. Now, part of the problem here is I've never actually been to one of the regional Python conferences. I've never been to Pi Tennessee or Pi Ohio or Pi Texas. And maybe if I went to one of those, I'd have a better picture of what it's like and what it would mean for Boston. But my strategy has been to have Boston Python be kind of like a regional conference spread out across the year, rather than a once-a-year event. Now, if someone listening to this thinks, hey, we should totally do it, and wants to get in touch, bring it. Let's try it.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say, I think that, just to sort of aid and abet what you're saying there, running a regional conference is a tremendous amount of work. And beyond work, it requires a significant financial investment, right? Like, there was actually a Boston RubyConf, I want to say 2 years ago. Tobias and I actually went to it, and it was awesome. It was really, 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 the quality of the speakers was very high. It was great. It was a great venue. It was just a really good time. And unfortunately, the people putting on the conference kind of took a bath financially because of one misstep, essentially, around, I think, hotel room booking or something like that.
You've convinced me not to do it.
That was not my goal, but But I mean, my point is that it's a significant venture even beyond a tremendous amount of work, right? There's a financial aspect, and there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So I think whoever wants to take it on has to either have those kind of deep pockets or have a solution to those problems at hand and be very realistic about it, because that same Rubicon conference this last year didn't come off because of problems with finding a venue, and there was another conference, Happiness Conf, that they were trying to put on here in Somerville, actually, where I live, that didn't get off the ground as well. So I feel like the difficulties are tremendous, and the potential for real serious harm to be done to the people who might try to pull this off is significant. So it's good to just sort of, be aware of what you're getting yourself into if you say, yeah, gee, I'd really like to do this.
Yeah, it's definitely a big undertaking. And we're putting a conference together at work, so I see what's going on there, and I understand that it's a big deal.
Shall we switch to the picks?
I'm not sure what a pick is.
Okay, well then let us assist you in that regard. So a pick is basically anything that you like, I should say like is not even a strong enough word, right? Like there's some new piece of technology that you found. It doesn't even have to be technology, like it could be a restaurant you really like, or a beer that you love that you want to recommend, or a board game that you played that you really, really like. Anything that you think is really cool that you think the listeners would find interesting that you want to recommend to people, or maybe something that you know of or want to help promote, right? Somebody who's doing great work in the community, or even some other community that you want to give a shout out to sort of point people in their direction.
Interesting. I should have thought about this ahead of time.
So
Okay.
I'll start us off. This time around, my first pick is going to be Scribed. It is a monthly subscription service for ebooks and audiobooks that lets you read and listen to as many books as you like. It has Android and iOS apps, so you can download the books to your device of choice and listen to it while you're on the go. And I've actually recently been using it to read a number of Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, and it has been good fun. My next pick is going to be Konch, Konch. It is a Python library that lets you write a little RC file that you put in your virtualenv or Python environment of choice, and it will set up your REPL for you, so you can use it to import various libraries ahead of time. You can have it do some setup. So if you have an application that requires a number of steps to get to a point where your REPL is usable to interact with your application, you can put that in your conch RC file, and then you just start it up by typing conch at your command line, and you're good to go. And my third pick is going to be Dupe Guru, which is a deduplication application. So if your hard drive is getting filled with lots and lots of copies of things and you're not quite sure where they all are and you just want to point something at the right direction and let it go, Dupe Guru is great for that. They actually also have specific builds for music and pictures, so it has slightly different algorithms for figuring out whether various things are a duplicate depending on if it's a picture or music application, and I've used it to clean up my network drive, and it has been quite fun and useful to use. So, Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Very cool. So, my first pick is a restaurant. Now, I realize picking a restaurant is kind of iffy because we have listeners, thank you, from all over the world. But, a lot of people end up making their way to New York City. I was in New York City this last weekend. My wife and I were visiting some family, and the relative that we were staying with, who's this awesome lady, took us to the River Cafe in Brooklyn. And what's so cool about this place is you are literally sitting in a cafe underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. So you're overlooking the river that the Brooklyn Bridge goes over. Just to show you how clueless I am, I don't know what that river is. But in any case, the cafe... I'm sorry?
It's the East River.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. I am a New York newbie.
I grew up in Manhattan.
Oh, there you go. Thanks. The cafe is filled with flowers inside and out. The food is just amazing, and you get to look out over the river and look up to the bridge, and it's an amazing place, and it was one of those kind of magical moments that I will long remember. So I love that place. I highly recommend it. My next pick is something called Pythonista. I know a lot of tech people are really down on Apple and iOS devices, but I love my iPad to bits. And this is a Python development environment for the iPad. Not like running on a computer where you cross-compile or something. It is a self-hosted development environment. They've optimized the keyboard that the application presents for writing Python. And moreover, it's not just a Python like, CLI that lets you print text. It is a full GUI environment, so you can actually write honest-to-God, touch-based iOS applications and even submit them to the App Store. It is super cool, and the guy who wrote it is just totally impresses me. It's a beautiful, pleasant to use, and I've actually been working through the first chapter of Reuven Lerner's Python Makes Practice Makes Python book that was mentioned in the last episode with it. My next pick is a game, also for iOS. I'm revealing my Apple fanboy status here. It's called Rototo, and it's by the folks from Thoughtbot, a Ruby on Rails, or now these days I can't even say that, but they started out as a Ruby on Rails consultancy shop here in Boston. And it's really neat, and the idea basically is you are in a ship, and you don't have any offensive capabilities whatsoever, but you end up destroying your enemies by using your shields and having their shots bounce back and hit them. It's a really clever, really hard, and a great deal of fun. My last pick is a beer, because I like to pick beers, and I don't think I picked one last month. This is one of my favorite beers of all time. It's like one of those fallbacks that, like, when someplace has it on tap, I'm really excited. It's Stone Brewing's Arrogant Bastard. It's just a really, really good ale. It's got a tremendous amount of depth. It's on the malty side, and I tend to prefer that. I'm not a huge hops person. It's a great, great ale that I highly recommend if anybody has the opportunity to try it, especially on tap, but it even stands up pretty well in a bottle. And that's it for me for picks. Ned, take it away, please.
Okay, I will start with a Python library that Python tool that people maybe already use, but I just can't recommend it highly enough, and that is Tox, T-O-X, which can automate the creation of virtual ends with different versions of Python, and then running your tests under those different versions. If you need a way to install multiple versions of Pythons, I recommend a tool called Pythons with a Z, which is very good at installing whatever version of Python you want. Do you want to have both 2.7.7 and 2.7.9? You just ask Pythons to install them and it will. For non-Python stuff, for my mobile game, I like Spell Tower, which is sort of a combination of Boggle and Tetris. It isn't going to hurt your fingers from having to click too fast. It's not a twitchy game. It's a thinking game. And lastly, I recommend Richard Feynman's Cornell Lectures, which you can find on YouTube, and I actually wrote a blog post about it a couple of months back when I was listening to them. It's 7-hour-long videos of him lecturing at Cornell University in the early 60s, and if you've never listened to Richard Feynman speak, you should do it. He's talking about the fundamentals of physics, but he does it with a thick Bronx accent and the humor to go with it.
Yeah, I definitely want to second the Feynman lectures. When they appeared on YouTube, I was so excited because I am not, how should I say this? I am a physics wannabe. I find it really fascinating, but I'm not very good at math, so I end up doing a lot of reading where I kind of comprehend some of it and kind of don't. But even so, watching the lectures was a real treat, just because I've read a lot about him. I've read his books, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, and so yeah, surely you're joking, and it was just so neat to actually see the man and to get a sense for his personality. It really showed through, and you really can get a sense of why he was, is considered one of the most charismatic men in science. Very cool stuff.
Yep, I totally agree.
All right. Well, we want to thank you very much for joining us tonight, Ned. And for anybody who wants to follow you and what you're up to, what would be the best way to do that?
So I'm on Twitter as Ned Bat, N-E-D-B-A-T. It's also my IRC nick, and my website is nedbatchelder.com, which NEDBATCHELDER.com. And Boston Python is at bostonpython.com.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure our listeners will greatly enjoy listening to this episode, and maybe we'll bring you on again in the future to talk about something else.
Okay, anytime.